Hi, and welcome to Sustainability 310 and the section on globalization, where we look at the relationship between globalization and sustainability, and also more specifically at the demographic changes that have been impelled by or are the result of globalization. And these, of course, include a rapid population growth, as well as lots of migration, both within countries and between countries, and the rise of cities. So, what has happened in the last 150 years or so is that, of course, we went to the Industrial Revolution in the mid 1800s. And prior to that, we had uh, colonization, mostly by European powers of non-European regions throughout the world, South America, South Asia, India, and so on. This is, we call this colonialism. And this was not exactly globalization. It was more like mercantile capitalism, if you will. And what that means is the colonial powers basically occupied these regions. Some of these regions were not countries at that point; they were just empires or kingdoms or something of that sort, but not modern nation states at that time. And they extracted natural resources from these places, send them back to Europe, which was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. These natural resources were then converted back into goods and sold throughout Europe, as well as sold to the countries from which the natural resources were taken, often without any recompense or compensation to these countries. So this works really well because you're not really paying for the resources that you're plundering from another place. But at this time, we can start to see sort of the first implications of this kind of trade, and this is primarily in the area of waste. If you are taking lots and lots of resources from another country, if you're taking lots of resources from another country and not having to actually account for efficient use of those resources, why would you have to not account for efficient use of resources? Well, if you're getting something for free, we tend to waste it. And so at this time period, you kind of start to see that mentality develop where we were not really paying attention to the ecological implications, the environmental implications. Sustainability wasn't even a word at that point of our the political economy of colonial or colonialism, mercantile capitalism, and so the world enters a new era where we have finished products that are being produced. So again, if you are not paying attention to what the resources actually cost, you're more likely to misuse, misallocate, or overuse those resources. You're more likely to be wasteful. And so this is kind of the first time that we start to really encounter this phenomena, which is the extraction of natural resources for large scale industrial production. Now, on one hand, this created, at least historically speaking, an unprecedented or unparalleled rise in consumer items in the 1800s. Industrial Revolution, the mechanization of labor, produced lots of finished goods, and typically um, this resulted, at least in certain parts of the world, Europe, United States, and later Japan, an increase in what might loosely be called a general quality of life. Now, we do understand that quality of life is not just a function of the amount of stuff that is available, right, for one to consume. But in at least economic terms, we equate human welfare with an increase in the abundance of both the quantity of consumer goods, finished consumer goods, as well as the quality of consumer goods. So this started happening in the 1800s, and it's a phenomena that slowly engulfed the world. World War One and then World War II sort of uh, created a temporary halt to this phenomena, this integration of this globalization. Countries became more isolated as an experience of the World War. But soon after World War, many countries that were formerly under the colonial thumb, so to speak, were colonized, became free. Large parts of sub-Saharan Africa became nations for the first time. India became a nation for the first time, modern nation state, in the 1940s, and so on. So this the advent of the modern nation state, coupled with industrial revolution would spread from Europe to kind of all parts of the world, and the increasing integration, right, of the world as a result of globalization and interdependencies that are engendered by globalization, and the opening up of markets all over the world, and the increase in industrial production. All of this created what you and I today take for granted as the modern economy. But this has not always been the case. This has not always been the case. An interesting impact of all of this was an increase in human population. If you look at a human population throughout history, as long as we've been around as Homo sapiens, um, we've pretty much been at this sort of plateau in terms of population. It's not really until the 1800s that we start to sort of take off in numbers. And then, of course, today we're at 7.5 billion or so, and on our way to 9 billion, maybe more, maybe 11 billion. And why did this happen? Well, we conceptualize this in terms of the demographic changes that occur as a society moves through pre-industrial, industrial, and post-industrial phase. What happens during the pre-industrial phase? You have lots of births and lots of deaths. That means you have lots of babies being born, but people are also dying. Nobody really makes it to the older ages. And since you don't have that many older people, and you also have a high mortality or death rate for actually every age, but particularly for older people and younger kids, death rate and birth rate are kind of the same. Very little population growth, as you can see here. Industrial revolution happens, or industrialization happens in countries. This often brings increasing standard in the economy, or an increase in the standard of living, and accompanying that increase in standard of living is public health measures are adopted, and they're more widespread. Basically, the more money you make, the better health care you have, the better public health care you have. Death rates start to drop off, birth rates hold a bit constant, old habits die hard, and you have the biggest natural increase. Natural increase meaning more babies being born than number of people dying. And you have a population boom right here. And then as countries become really, really wealthy or more developed, birth rates start to sort of taper off. And you can see this, right? In many developed countries throughout the world, in particular places like Japan and China, fertility rates have plummeted. The average woman can be expected to have no more than 1.5, 1.4 children, which is not enough to basically replace mom and dad. You need to have at least 2 kids, or 2.1 is the magic number for what we call replacement level fertility. So as number of births drop, women enter the labor force in greater and greater numbers. The number of births drop, and people are living longer. The consequence of this is very low population growth or negative population growth, which is the case in places like Germany and increasingly slow places like Japan as well. European countries are also facing the same this demographic time bomb, if you will. As they have become wealthier, they have also become less likely to have kids. People are living longer. This creates a unique burden on society because you need young people basically to support the older people in terms of contributing to health insurance schemes, pension, and whatnot. And so this is where we are in many parts of the world that are older and grayer and richer. This is where we are in parts of the world that are younger, not as rich or poorer. This would be sub-Saharan Africa, India, South Asia, and so on. Okay, so going back to the story of globalization. Why do we care about globalization? What does it do? What is it as a phenomenon? What is its relationship to sustainability? Well, the basic idea is that as countries mature, and by mature I mean economically mature, they specialize increasingly in the things that they are really good at making. This is the basis of something we call comparative advantage, and it's shown right here, comparative advantage. As they specialize, they become more efficient at making certain goods, and so they make more of those goods, and they make them more efficiently, so prices drop for those goods. Now, if these countries trade with each other, what happens is, in the end, there are more goods in the world. They're sold for increasingly less money. They're cheaper, and their quality is higher. And to really appreciate this phenomenon, all you have to do is look at consumer electronic items. Look at the cost of computers, televisions, audio equipment, anything really that is technologically driven. In particular, it is not only do we have more variety, we also have, in many cases, a higher quality product that is in nominal dollar terms certainly cheaper, and in many cases in real dollar terms as well, because of globalization and comparative advantage. So comparative advantage is a concept when one region can make a good or bundle of goods most efficiently compared to all other goods. So there is, from an economic standpoint, what we call a reduced opportunity cost, right? And I've posted some videos on this as well as a definition is given right here. But opportunity cost is another way of saying indirect cost. It's not only the direct cost of producing something that matters, but it's also the indirect cost or what you have given up. Uh, for example, if you were to buy a shirt, it's not just the cost of the shirt compared to the cost of, let's say, other shirts that matters, but you could have used that like $10 or $15 that you spent on the shirt. You could have left it in a bank, made interest on it. You could have bought food with it. You could have donated to charity. Opportunity cost measures all of the other things you could have used that $10 or $15 for, not just in terms of the shirt, but also the indirect costs associated with that. This is the essence of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the cornerstone, the crux of globalization, right? And so the story here is then that as countries become more industrialized, they become part of the global market economy. They become more democratic. Democracy, we think, is also very closely linked to globalization, though not always the case, right? Because China has been able to enter sort of the capitalist regime without really becoming fully democratic. Um, as countries enter this global partnership, countries specialize, they trade, number of goods goes up, right? The quantity of goods goes up, the quality of goods goes up, and we're all happy because we just have more stuff to buy and our quality of life is higher. That is at least the story of globalization. So globalization is supposed to not only increase the number of goods, but it also makes countries richer, thereby making people better. Of course, that is only part of the story, right? Because what else has happened with globalization is that now there is a decline in poverty, and I give you some stats on this right here. But these positive impacts have not impacted everybody uniformly. Some countries, some places have benefited more, others have not benefited as much, right? So there are winners and then there are losers in globalization. And the environment, in many cases, is a loser. Why? Because today we equate the production of more and more goods, the quantity of goods, with increasing standard of living. So we think that standard of living has something very deeply to do with the availability of lots and lots of things that we can buy. And in many cases, some of us thinking of our own lives, that certainly is true, right? I mean, the more stuff we have, the more easier our lives are, the more sometimes, at least in the short term, we tend to feel happier. On the other hand, this phenomena has a profound impact on the environment because need is not fixed, right? If you think about what you really need to survive, you don't really need all that much. You need, using Mr. Maslow, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or the pyramid of needs, the only thing you really need is food, shelter, water, sleep. Right? Anything beyond that is really a want. So our wants have slowly become needs as we have entered the age of globalization and increased number of goods have made their way into our lives. So stuff that we kind of did okay without before. Many of you probably don't remember a time where you didn't have smartphones, right? When internet didn't exist. And now these things seem an inextricable and essential part of living. But this was not the case as recently as 15, 20, 25 years ago, right? So what was a sort of a luxury item, the internet, pagers and then cell phones, has now become an absolute necessity. It has become a need. And so to support this increasing appetite that human beings have for products, we must become not only more skilled at extracting products from the earth as natural resources, but more skilled at converting them into finished products. And whoever does this more efficiently and can market it better wins, at least in the short term. But who is the real winner in this? Well, it's us. We have more products. It's also corporations that provide this more money, and it's human beings really, right? Corporations are also made up of human beings. Who are the real losers? Well, everybody else, the planet, ecosystems, and then I would argue also human beings in the long term, because we are not considering the long term impacts of this way of living. Resource extraction, and the production of an increasing amount of consumer goods. We're not only going to impact the flora and fauna of this planet as a result of this, but also us in the long run. Unfortunately, most of our solutions to this kind of problem have been, let's come up with better technology, as opposed to really looking at, well, maybe there's something about the underlying economic system which needs to be addressed. And the underlying economic system is one of these sort of this globalized political economy. Oh, sorry, excuse me, the political economy of globalization, which again equates human welfare with an increasing number of consumer products. Of course, the story is not that simple, right? I mean, people derive happiness from a lot of different things, but this is sort of the lay of the land. What capitalism and globalization have done is they have increased specialization. And as they have increased specialization, your capacity to provide the very essentials for yourself has diminished. Because as a consumer, you are really good, or as rather a producer, you might be good at one or two things. And you are compelled to, because of the way the system is set up, to use those specialized skills in very specific arenas, which means that you have to buy everything. And this is sort of the key point, that you have to buy everything else that you need on the market. You cannot make it for yourself. You can't. Now you can choose to maybe grow your own food in your backyard, but you certainly won't have access to the full panoply of food goods that you would if you just went to the local supermarket, if you just relied on the food products that you made. And certainly none of us are capable of making the high-end technological consumer products, right? So we're all beholden, we're all obligated to the market. The market requires specialization. It makes everybody interdependent, which is very good in some ways, but it also takes away our capacity to provide for ourselves, and it creates waste. So coming back to the impacts on population, now the story so far, right? Globalization has helped increase population levels, has helped increase waste, as I just mentioned. Um, the other piece to this is this thinking originally sort of put forth, or this theory put forth by Malthus, Thomas Malthus, and what he basically said was that human population growth will occur because growth is geometric, food supply is arithmetic, and what that really means is that um, human beings will rapidly multiply and far outstrip the capacity of the earth in terms of resources to provide for themselves. So population growth, resources, you'll have a crisis point, you'll have famines, wars, and the whole thing will come to an end, and then you'll have growth again. So this sort of sine wave of growth and population decline will continue. But instead, what has happened is globalization has actually created more products. It's also the globalization of food systems, or rather food production, has also created an unprecedented level of food on the planet. Though we still have starvation today, something like 750 million, 950 million people are calorie insufficient, meaning they don't get the 1,800 calories a day that they need, 1,800 to 1,900 calories a day required for survival. We have far fewer people who are living in extreme poverty as a percentage of the world's population. And we have far fewer people who are starving as a percentage of the world's population today than we did even 30 years ago. So in many ways, we have been successful at providing more and more people with more and more stuff, including food. On the other hand, there are certainly impacts of this, and the environmental impacts are a huge part of this. And the changes in dietary patterns, which we'll look at later, have also been pretty profound. We have shifted from, again, a model where we produce a lot of our own food for our families, our villages, to one where we are increasingly reliant on agribusiness, large food producing businesses that exist around the world that provide food at ever reduced costs at greater quantities. And this Doesn't sound like a bad thing, except until you consider that, well, food is a resource. It does impose an environmental cost, and also, what does all this extra food mean? To answer this question, just look around you and see at our increasing waistlines. The public health impacts of too much food also cannot be ignored, as well as too much of certain types of food, animal products in particular, cannot be ignored, right? And so there's both public health costs of this of the globalization of food production, as well as environmental costs. And here we have some charts that look at the increase in population, which has occurred. Most of this, again, is occurring in poorer countries. The more developed regions have falling birth rates, fertility rates, so they're not growing as much. Poorer countries, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, growing quite a bit. World population in 2013 and then 2050 projections. And these are kind of hard to really pin down because it depends on changes in fertility, meaning we typically think, as I mentioned out earlier, as countries go through their demographic transitions and become industrialized and post-industrialized, birth rates or fertility rates drop. But this is not always the case. This is not always the case. Some countries have still continued to maintain high fertility rates despite becoming a little bit richer. This chart looks at the age distribution. This is age structure by sex. Or the sort of the proverbial population pyramid, and you can see that in poorer countries, you have lots of babies, not that many old people, some in the middle ranges. In richer countries, you much less babies, more working age, and much more older people. But eventually, these working age will become part of the older generations, and it'll become kind of an inverted pyramid, right? Which is also not good. This is not ideal. This is also not ideal. You kind of want a pyramid that's sort of somewhere in between, where you have a good fertility rate. You have, at least two children per couple, but not much more than that. That is able to sort of feed into, these kids will become teenagers and then working age, and they can support the increasingly the larger sector of the population that is living longer and longer. Okay. I am going to stop now at this portion of the lecture. I've given you kind of a general overview of the relationship between economic growth, capitalism, globalization, and changes in population. We have already been through some of the things that we can do to address these issues. And here, a little bit later on in this lecture, I look at that. I'm going to scroll through this a bit. So what can we do, as we are entering this era of increasing production and increasing environmental impact as a result of that production? Well, we have to conceptualize the environment, people, the flora and the fauna, that flora meaning the other plants, fauna meaning the other animals that are part of this earth in terms of one large ecosystem. Right? And everything that we do impacts everything else. Now, this is easy to say, but we really have to look at these linkages. Because it's not just about the impacts on human beings that are important, it's the impact on the whole planet. Why? Well, if we're maintaining completely only a selfish perspective, at some point, all the negative impacts on the planet are going to impact us negatively. But if we look at it sort of in a more moral way, an ethical way, also in a way which looks at the sustainability of the entire planet and the right of other creatures to also coexist with us, and it also becomes a moral question. Not just a question of how we can only help human beings, but also how we can help other living things and the planet survive in the long term. And so that is sustainable development. What are its potentials? What is its potential? We have covered some of this already when we looked at the components of sustainability, right? A sustainable society is economically sustainable. It is environmentally sustainable, and it is also socially sustainable. And so there are lots of different things, and I've covered some of those things in this lecture to kind of give you an outline of them. The Millennium Development Goals were about that, about achieving a higher quality of life for all of this planet's residents, not just in terms of money, but in terms of public health, in terms of equity, political participation, literacy, gender equality, and so on. So there are lots of things that we can do. Here's some examples of sustainable development, the potential. And I'll let you read these. You have the lectures. How do we do that? Well, we have to look at virtually all aspects of society. It's not just the economy. The economy, of course, is a central part of it, but we have to look at all aspects of society and make some choices collectively that don't just look at the welfare of individual cities or nations, but the whole planet. The whole planet. Why? Because truly, our destinies are bound up in each other's. Globalization, the heart of globalization, is an interdependency. And so, if we don't learn to value this interdependency and make it better in the long run, I think the consequences are pretty clear, right? We will either all rise together or we will perish together. Okay, thank you, and more to come soon.